Journal Night.
Good evening and welcome to Wednesday night's edition of the Rangers Journal. First things first, if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe. I see Scotty is going crazy trying to get down to that last 20 subscribers. So if you know MD, I've heard of MD, you're walking in the shops, you're walking in the streets, and you see MD, please ask him to subscribe to the Rangers Journal. And if we can make it tonight, I think we'll be the heroes for this evening. So that's the thinking. Welcome to the Wednesday night's edition. We will be here for the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes. I'm going to introduce the panel first. So I'm your host for tonight. So I'm Gary. I'm going to introduce the panel, say hello, and then we will crack on with something a little bit different, hopefully, than the daily bashing of certain players and the daily raving about certain other players and so on. So we'll change it around a little bit. So first, Tomo, good to see you. How are we?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me on, and looking forward to this, and looking forward to the different opinions and the comments in the comments section. So anyone watching, make sure you get involved. I think it could be a bit of a lively debate.
Yeah. Hopefully, definitely it's hopefully going to spark some interest because we all have opinions, and that's why we want to challenge some of those opinions at times. Doug, what about yourself? How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Evening, everybody. Glad to be here. Jumping on to replace Ross, who decided hospitality at Man City was more appealing than spending an evening with you guys. So next time he's on, I hope you'll give him a good ribbon for that one. But I'm always here and happy to talk to you. So looking forward to it.
Good. And Ross will tell you about celebrity meetings, I think, when he next time. We won't surprise it. We won't shock him to tell you what's happened. But he's had a great night so far from what we've seen from his pictures. And Ricky, how are you?
Good evening, guys. Glad to be here. Looking forward to it. Looking forward to getting into the debate and see what the opinions may be. I'm sure there'll be a vast array of different opinions what we're going to go through tonight. But yeah, thanks for having me on, Gary. Looking forward to it.
Good. So I think for us, as a start now, so this episode is called Fact or Fiction, and it's kind of based around the principle that there's a lot of people say a lot of things about football and about life in general. In fact, it kind of came about because a certain Mr. Trump was saying about the dogs and cats, they're eating the dogs and cats. It's a fact. And I think it was a line at the end that just made me think about it. I thought, just by saying it's a fact at the end doesn't make it true. And I thought there's an episode here. There's something we can talk about. So I suppose what I'll start with, I'll start with you, Ricky. What's the kind of what's Rangers fact that people say or spout or give an opinion on do you think is the most jarring for you?
Finances, I think, is probably a big, huge topic. Where we are, where we're lacking. That coupled with I suppose the hierarchy of the club. Our chairman's just recently stood down. We've got an interim chairman in there with no CEO, and it just the whole club seems a little bit disjointed. And I think the lack of transparency this season, especially when you're given the fact that Ibrox was going to be delayed at the beginning of the season, we never really get told any of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of ifs and buts in those two areas I've just mentioned there. The transparency, I think if the club at a higher end were just honest and upfront, everybody would then be able to sort of take heed and move on. But it's all this people, rumours, scaremongering, and the transparency thing, I think, it doesn't help. We need to be a bit more transparent and open with the punters, or we'll always be at this kind of debate, sort of talking about things.
And that's what makes football, I suppose, and that's part of the reason we're going to talk tonight. Tom, if I was to ask you, what's the most jarring fact? And I use fact, I'm not going to do inverted commas because nobody would like seeing that, but what sort of thing gets your goat when people say it's a fact?
I've been seeing quite a lot recently of people saying that, I've been following Rangers for X amount of years and this is the worst Rangers team I've ever seen. And I think people either forget what happened between 2012 and 2016, 2017, or have just deleted that whole period from their memory. We may not be where we want to be this season, but ultimately, we win at Hearts. We're maybe looking at the start of our season a little bit more differently and not as bad as what what people seem to think it was. We're in a bit of a transitional period at the moment. New players. We've got rid of the deadwood that people wanted rid of, and we're getting new players settled into the team. So I think that it's disaster that it seems to be, and I don't quite think it is. I just think as a fan base we need a bit of patience.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And Doug, what about yourself then? So the fact that I probably got a fair idea what this is, some of the fact that jars you the most when people talk about it and say it to be true.
Well, funnily enough, I didn't actually think about it before the show, but as you were asking Tomo, the most ridiculous one that popped in my head is the alternate universe that the other side of the city likes to sit in, that we are somehow this newfangled 12-year-old club who has nothing to do with what came before it. I think that kind of fanciful notion would actually be my number one. But focusing on the things that we sort of look at and that our fans talk about, I think the big thing for me is the revisionism that can happen with players, and how they go from being amazing to horrendous within a week or a season or whatever it might be. And that, like, you see people just totally swing opinions sometimes. Or indeed, the even more classic one is become entrenched in an opinion once they've kind of put it out there and defended it a little, and then when it turns out to maybe not be the case, they just can't bring themselves to change their mind. So you kind of touched on it a little yourself when you mentioned Hadji. I think opinions about him have gone up and down over the last couple of years, and there's other players who I won't mention that have gone from being the fan base's favourite player to being the worst player in the universe, and somehow all of the other years of that player's time have become awful, despite nothing changing. But that's probably the one that annoys me the most.
No, that's a great one. I'm going to give a plug here for those that haven't read the Rangers Journal Facebook page. Doug done a fantastic article about that said player, and it's well worth a read. It kind of picks up on some of the history from there. So we'll move on. So that's kind of setting the scene a little bit. There's a great line from David Mitchell, for those that know who he is. Would I lie to you, team captain, Peep Show over the years. He was an actor, historian, whatever it is. And I think I always remember him saying, he said, facts are, there's no such thing as facts anymore. Facts are just opinions. And the more people that believe that opinion, the more it becomes fact. So it's irrelevant whether it's actually true or not. If you say it loud enough people believe it, it becomes fact. And that's where this shows really came from. So we're going to look at three particular facts that I've heard in the last few weeks. Three particular ones that are commonly said. And we could have done, if I've been honest, I think I'd said to Doug, I wrote about 20 of them. I could have wrote tons of them, and we can, if there's more episodes of this and it goes well and we get those subscribers, we will look at other ones. But for that tonight, we're going to look at three particular ones. And how we're going to do it, we're going to ask you, I'm going to tell you the fact. You're going to give your initial view on what that fact, the accuracy of that fact and how you feel about it. And then we'll delve into a little bit of maybe the reality. And it could be that come the end the fact is true. It could be that come the end that we disagree. But hopefully we reach an opinion whereby you think if it was that program, Room 101 or something like that, where you make a decision and put it in the bin. It's a fact or a fiction outcome, and then we move on and never disagree again on it. That's the thinking. That's how it's go. We'll see how this works. And first thing I would say is thanks to Doug, who's done all the slides for me. I've been busy working away, and he's been, poor guys, had nothing to eat. I'm no doubt rushing the slides and getting them finished for me just before it started. So thank you for that. The first fact we're going to look at is Michael Beale signed only duds. So Michael Beale was in charge for a year, and signed a number of players. We won't look yet at those players he signed, but I'm going to get your views, and very briefly, what your views on whether the statement that Michael Beale signed only duds, it's a fact. Ricky, what's your thoughts?
Well, I can't say that he signed every single player was a dud. I would certainly go to the side of most of them were duds. Although Lammers, we've managed to get rid of him now. We actually, I believe we kind of broke even for him. So Lammers was technically a decent football player, but just could not fit into the Scottish style of play. So I'm not Dessers' biggest fan. I think, that isn't a fact that he's a good player. So Sterling came in under Beale, I believe. I think he's a gem of a player. Got him in for free from Chelsea, I think. But for some reason, we cannot find a position for that lad. So there was another couple of players that came in and haven't actually made the grade. Is it Raskin that came in? Early doors at the winter break, wasn't it? He came in, and I think Raskin's a player. I think he will come good. This season needs to be good. So when you look at Sterling, you look at Raskin. Who was the other person that came in alongside Raskin at the same time?
Cantwell.
Todd Cantwell. Well, Todd Cantwell on his day was one of the better players in Scottish football on his day, but he's a bit of an enigma, isn't he? He just had that sort of a belief that he thought he was better than what he actually was, in my opinion, and sometimes it went against him, and he's out the club now. So, most of those players, apart from Raskin and Sterling, are still with the club, but I do believe those two players were plus points. The other ones, no, I don't think were good players, in my opinion.
That's what this is about. It's all about opinions, Ricky. That's where we'll come back to later on. Tomo, your view. So Michael Beale signed only duds. Discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with Ricky. What I would say is that of all the players that he signed, how many of them are nailed on in the starting 11? Jack Butland, he was signed by Beale, wasn't he? I think.
Yeah.
So you've got Butland who plays every game, Dessers who plays every. You've got Danilo in there as well. Unfortunately for him, he's had injuries, so you can't really say he's set the heaven alight since he's been with us. Raskin hasn't kept down a place. Cantwell's gone. So while I wouldn't necessarily say they're all duds, you can't exactly say they've lightened up the team. They've improved the whole team. Even Butland has sort of dipped the last sort of 6 months or so. So I wouldn't say they were all duds, but you need the likes of Raskin and Sterling really start nailing down a first team place and coming good. And Dessers is always going to divide opinions. The guy, first season in Scottish football, he got 26 goals. Can't really argue with that as a striker. He's putting the ball in the net. Do we need better than him? Yes, we do. But would I call him a dud? Definitely not. So I wouldn't say all these signings were duds, but I would say probably about 80-90% of them were.
Right, Tom says 89%. Ricky says the majority. Doug, what's the initial first thoughts for you?
I feel like I've got a bit of an unfair advantage. Obviously, I haven't put the slides together.
Don't tell them.
Everything's in. No, I'm not saying anything specific, but I was just saying, like, I've obviously got everyone clear in my mind. But I was trying to think of what I was thinking last night when I was first thinking about or whenever it was you sent me. I can't remember if it was last night or this morning. Whenever it was you first sent me the idea, and I kind of thought at the time my brain kind of went to half and half because I was thinking of a couple that I thought are decent enough. I think, when you say dud, to me, dud is a complete failure. So a player that offered us nothing and was just a complete and utter waste of time. So I'm not sure if any of them, maybe Cifuentes, if he ends up leaving at the end of his loan, could potentially fall into that category because he never really had any great games. He was kind of okay. But I think everyone else has offered something at some point, and then just hasn't. The ones that haven't worked out for various reasons. Obviously, we mentioned Cantwell. He's the kind of player that at the right club with the right manager will be a great player, but to get both things lining up at the right time is a difficult thing when you need both to be right, and I think he kind of does, because he had that spell at Norwich, obviously, where I think he did get it all together, and that was when he was getting rated at like 30-40 million. And like I say, most of the others have shown bits and bobs and could still come good as well, because quite a lot of them, the majority of them, are still here. So I would probably have said maybe 50-50. I think some of them get a slightly harsh deal. So Dessers, for example, gets a harsh deal because of the cost of him, which is not his fault. And at the end of the day, you know, regardless of what we spend on the player, the job of the player is the same, to come in and perform. And while you will adjust the success based on that, you know, if he'd come in for 500,000, people would be saying, "Oh, Dessers was a great buy, 500,000, 20 goals, great squad player." It's the fact that it cost, you know, closer to 5 million, that people are going, "Well, you can't have a £5 million squad player." But then, I mean, you could, if that's what it ends up being. So there's sort of aspects like that, I think, as well, that can come into play. So I would say 50-50 would be would have been what I'd have said if I hadn't spent the last two hours staring at all of them.
No. So Doug's 50-50. Ricky's a couple of players were decent. Almost 89% were failures, are failures. So I think, and the reason why I've picked this one as the first topic is because a lot of the time we do hear that Rangers recruitment is what's put them in this position, and it's a failed recruitment, or the failed decisions around recruitment now, and that might be the case. But I think sometimes it's worth maybe just going back and seeing. I think it's a wonderful thing, isn't it? So I think if we go back and look at those signings, and I'll maybe get Doug to put up the slide for here now, that kind of shows you the 9 or 10 players, or is it 10, 11 players that were signed in that era. Do you call something for a year an era? And I think, as I said, so we've got Danilo. I'm just like, well, do you know what? I'm going to quickly go through. I'm going to shout out a name, and I'm going to pick one of you just to quickly say good or bad, right? You know, so Danilo, Tomo, success, failure.
Failure so far.
Right? Doug, Dessers, success, failure.
I would call him a success. He's come in, he scored 20 goals. He's what, 7 and 9 or however it is thus far this season. He's doing what a striker needs to do. He's not the striker in terms of the number one striker that we need, because he's still maybe a little short in some of the some games. He does miss glaring chances and big chances. So he's not everything we need, but he's still a decent player. And like I say, I hate these people that say that he's totally useless. You cannot score 20 goals a season if you're totally useless, unless you're somehow. What was that goalkeeper sketch where he, no matter what happens when the ball gets kicked, he's always hitting the face. Unless you're that for strikers, and he's just always getting hit and rebounds. But yeah, I would call him a success in general.
Ricky, there's nothing. I'm jumping away to another side here, but how do you think how do you think Chris Boyd would be viewed nowadays if he's playing today?
Well, Chris Boyd was a very frustrating player because he never really linked to playing up Pink Boy, Chris Boyd, but by God, he was a finisher. That's one thing that boy could do, to put the ball in the back of the net, and that's what Cyril Dessers can't do. So Cyril Dessers is a worker. I'm not convinced his positional play is that great, whereas Boyd's was. And I think that's the difference. And Boyd would never have came anywhere near £4.2 million when we brought him in from Kilmarnock.
No.
And I think that's the difference for me. You're bringing somebody in from Camosi for that late of money, and we're not getting the value for the money we're spent. That's why I think he comes under the failure bracket, the same as Danilo. Danilo needs to prove himself. I don't think Danilo will ever prove himself at our club, unfortunately. I think he's just going to be constantly injured. Lammers, you know, just looking at the air, we a big loss in him. I mean, these were all players that were probably, by all accounts, all brought in the back of a computer sort of a slide, wasn't it? And all that kind of stuff that was going on because of his recruitment. Todd Cantwell, a good player, but again, you know, Celtic don't buy players and sell them for a loss. We need to get round this kind of situation where we are buying players in. Our recruitment over the past two managers has not been good enough for me. I think under Clement, the current recruitment period we just had, I think we've got one or two gems on the way.
We'll come back to that, Ricky. I would possibly challenge the opposition that the side of the City's recruitment's been good. What they've maybe had is one or two players at different times that made the money. I think if you remember rightly, the last season, every one of the new signings didn't play in the last game in the cup final or something like that. I think they've been fortunate that they've got the ability to do more, invest more, and gamble more maybe than we can. Whether the recruitment's any better, At times it's maybe debatable. But anyway, that's a pod for another story. So just looking very brief, I don't want to get into every single one of them, but we've got Sterling, who seems to be high on people's minds as a real asset. Butland, who's obviously England's number 6, is it? If he does almost made the squad. Balogun, who's most fans are a huge fan of. Sima, who's a huge fan for most people. So, and then as you say, Dessers, Danilos is unfortunate. Campbell, I don't think anybody could argue was a bad player. Wrong movie maybe. And Raskin was a Belgian under 21. And I suppose I'm just going to ask you to go back very briefly in your head, and I maybe pick Doug for this. If you go back in time, was hindsight's one of the thing and all that stuff. Is there any of those players you didn't think still, on the principle, would have been good signings?
No, I mean, I think when you look at obviously, like you say, going back, you've got more knowledge, but at the time, I think they all looked decent enough signings. The only one I didn't really know hugely well was Cifuentes. But I think the rest of them, they all kind of mostly stood up. There are some slight concerns in terms of some of the numbers for the strikers. But that's the thing with when you're buying strikers at the kind of level that we do, you're going to have varying numbers because they'll tend to be players that are maybe good in some leagues or good in some systems, but not just good universally, because if they're good universally, they'll be playing at better teams. So I think they were all reasonably decent signings. They, again, kind of roughly fit the types of players we want to get. Maybe slightly still leaning on that slightly too old, or on some of the we can reform them championship style players. But overall, I think they were decent enough signings. And like I say, I do think, looking at the list, about half of them have been decent signings, and there's still potential. Obviously, Raskin and Danilo, I think, still have the potential to go on and be good players for us, and hopefully will be. Butland's been good, and Balogun's been steady, given he's a free signing. And with someone like Sam Lammers, who I think most people would consider to be a failure, I consider him more to be a failure due to Michael Beale than necessarily him as a player. He maybe didn't really suit Scottish football, but it didn't help that he wasn't being played in position either. And I think we've kind of seen that, when he's gone away and been played just as a striker, which is what he prefers to do, he's been a success. So I think there's an aspect to that as well. It's that, looking back, how many of these failures were to do with Beale as a coach than maybe they were the players themselves. So I think that's something we'll be able to tell in the future when we see them all for longer under Clement.
No, that's great. We'll come up at the end of this one, because we've got a few more we're going to look at. I suppose one of the rationale behind this was when I had a rough idea who we signed, I thought, most of them players that we probably rate to some degree at one point in time, I thought they had the ability. Some of them still do. I think was it Jack Butland's one of the best keepers meant to be still. Balogun, with some people want him as captain. Sterling, people want to play in goals and up front everywhere. So that there's certain, and Seema we all wanted back. So certainly he brought a level of quality, whether it was enough quality and whether and ultimately proved not to be through tactics and all the other things. So just to conclude this one first question, having had your preconceived view, having looked now, Tomo, has it changed any, or is it still the same, or is it still think Beale signed only duds? It's a fact.
Yeah, as I say, I think like Lammers, I get what Doug's saying, but you look at his previous, apart from his first real couple of seasons as a professional, since then he's been poor, and we still went out and spent £3.5-4 million on him. So I would say, yeah, again, Kieran Dell's another one. Just what was the thought behind that signing? He was injured most of the time at Norwich, and okay, we got him on a free transfer, but you still have to pay wages. So I still think that the majority of them have been failures. Hopefully Raskin comes good, Sterling comes good, and Dessers keeps scoring. But I think Dessers at an age now where he's not going to improve much. We'll get what we get out of him, like we see most weeks. And when someone better comes along, which hopefully will be bigger man, we won't be seeing as much of him playing.
So this aside though, does fact or fiction for you? Fact? You're saying fact?
Yeah, I'd say
Right.
fact. Yeah, yeah.
So again, just we're doing this quickly so we can move on to the next one. Ricky, fact or fiction?
Based on his the cost of him, mate, I'm saying he's fiction.
Saying it was they signed Duds. So you mean it did sign Duds? So fact.
Well, out of the 11 players there, I would give credit to 5 and 6 not. So for me, the majority were duds.
Right, that's right. And Doug, yourself, fact or fiction?
Well, funnily enough, I'd actually quickly like to fact and fiction that point about Kieran Dowell. He'd only ever had one injury prior to signing for us of any significance. So I'd like to fiction that one. I mean, I would probably say fiction on the count of I don't think enough of them fall into duds completely for me, and I think there's still enough wiggle room for a couple to, as I say, come good. So as it stands, I would say fiction, but it maybe will depend on how a couple of these players finish up.
Yeah. And given you're the panel, you get the final cast and vote. So it's a two for a fact, one for a fiction. I have no locus in the decision making. It's going to be a fact that his signings were duds. So we'll move on to the second question now. The second question is one I read in a big banner a couple of weeks ago, saying back the manager, sack the board, I think was the one that was said. And it got me thinking again, what does that mean? What does that mean? I think the argument was the board hasn't supported Clement, and it's a fact. The board's not supported him. That's why we're in the position we're in. Ricky, is that the case? The board hasn't supported Clement? Fact or fiction is for you?
It's a difficult one, Gary, purely because I think, going back to Beale, a lot of the current board back Beale, and it goes back to his bad recruitment, left us in the situation we're in at the moment. And even going back a period before that to Gio, that was your sort of your Lindstroms and your people that were in big wages. We've offloaded those guys to free up wages, but there's money getting spent in stadium upgrades and all sorts of stuff. I should imagine that Clement was promised X, Y, and Z. I think we all assumed that's why we brought him in. And what made sort of adds to a little bit more confusion is the fact that they've gave him an extension, which again, to me, maybe others as well, we're going to promise you this, we're going to give you that, but it never materialised. I think that the lad from Seville, we could have got him in. It'd have been a high earner, but it would have been that number 6 position that we're all sort of screaming for. And I think at one point the boy was wanting to come in. Now, if the board were going to be backing Clement, that deal would have happened. So maybe the board aren't backing Clement.
So fact or fiction? You're saying it's fact then? Are you going with fact? Is that what you're saying?
The board is not backing Clement, yes.
Right. Tomo. So Ricky's went fact. The board are not backing Clement, haven't supported him. Fact or fiction? What's in your thoughts?
I think fiction. Got to be honest. I think every football manager in the world would like that little bit more to spend on players and have better players being recruited than what we've already got. But we've got to remember where we are. We have spent a lot of money over the last few years on players that unfortunately haven't gave us that return. We didn't sell the likes of Kent, Morelos when they were at the top end of their game, because we were basically backing a manager who didn't want to sell them. Whereas in hindsight, we should have sold them, got the money they left on free transfers. So I think we've got to remember where we are. In these days of financial fair play and everything else, you've got to be selling players to be able to buy players. In the summer, we got rid of a lot of high earners, a lot of the deadwood. And I would imagine Clement had been told, you need to get rid of people before we can sign them. And had we sold someone for a big amount of money, I've got no doubt that would have been invested back into the team. So it's hard for the board because, you know, I mentioned at the beginning, 2012, that's still fresh in everyone's mind. We don't want to be back there where we're overspending and getting into those sort of issues again. So I can see why we don't go out and don't spend money we don't have on the gamble that things are going to come good. So I will say fiction. I think Clermont has been back to a certain degree.
Yeah. And Doug, yourself?
Yeah, I would fiction that one as well. I think exactly what Thomas said. We can always spend more money, but that spend comes at a cost. I think generally we've backed the majority of our managers reasonably well. Some we could have done better than others. But the other thing that I think people don't factor in enough when looking at that is the individual contexts of each manager, where we were at the time, how we were doing, and things like that. At the end of the day, you know, we brought Clermont in to transition the team from a period of time where with a lot of players that were older on big wages, and sort of transforming that into something new. Now that's something that will take a couple of windows, so we're not going to have everything happening at once. But also came at the back of having kind of tried that a little bit with Beale, and so already having some significant investments like our 3 strikers who were all you know, high expenses for us. So I think we spent what we could, but at the end of the day, we didn't have huge money coming in, so it was the kind of one in, one out, which I think was the big sticking problem. I think they have rolled the dice on a couple of the players, but yeah, I don't really see how much you spent a reasonable amount, as we'll see. But I don't think there's a huge amount more they could do without front loading debt onto the club, basically, and hoping that it goes well.
I'm going to ask you then, because I was just reading this question from Bobby. This is slightly deviating, but you know more of this than most of us do. You do look at a lot of stats. Was one of the issues that Gerrard got a significant amount of money with no return, with no recovery in terms of transfers, and it was then left to others to start to go the one and one. I suppose I'm thinking, if you look at the investment that Gerrard made over the 2 or 3 years, it was significantly more than any of the others that ever got that right. As a net.
I mean, we did spend a lot of money in the first couple of seasons under Gerrard, but we had to, because the gap that Gerrard was having to bridge was significantly bigger than any gap that the manager since have bridged. Gerrard was taking over a team that had just, you know, not long been in the Premiership again, and was trying to bridge the gap from where we'd been over the last couple of years, where we, you know, weren't even a Premiership team, to then becoming a title-winning team. That's a huge gap to. I mean, that was a kind of a similar job to what we're asking Clermont to do in a way, in terms of he was changing a change of era. He was installing standards. He came in to bring Rangers back to that true pinnacle of where we used to be, because he was that type of player himself, playing at a big club who demanded the best and who always strived to be number one. And so he understood all that and was bridging that gap. So we had to spend money to do that. I don't think there was no return. I mean, he obviously did win a title. He didn't get enough cups, but he was very successful in Europe in terms of regular appearances into the slightly deeper levels of Europe in terms of qualifying from the groups and things like that. I think it's arguable. You know, well, I don't think it's arguable, actually. He started the period of what has been our best European performances for decades, albeit it's a slightly lower level, but a lot of the teams we're playing are still teams that also regularly feature in the Champions League, like your Dortmunds and your Leipzigs. And you know, he started and built all that. And yes, there's been a bit of up and down in terms of the signing since, but he signed duds as well. Not every player that he signed was perfect. We can all pick a few from that period as well. And I suppose the key thing, I think people bring up is that season before he left, where people say he didn't get backed, and if he'd been backed, he'd have stayed. But at the same time, I think every year our purchase power partly lies on whether or not we get into the Champions League. There's only so much we can do in advance of that point to try and get us there, because again, you're asking the club to take the risk. Do we front load the money to make sure we get to the Champions League and make sure, as I will put in quotation marks, because you can only make so much sure, as we saw with the Jeffy red card, not everything is in your control in terms of qualification. So they could have front loaded, bought the players they wanted, and then we still didn't get the Champions League, and then you're in a financial problem. So that's where the business side of the club has to remove the emotional aspect that the fans always have, and they have to look at it more clinically and go, right, well, if we spend 10 million now and don't get into the Champions League, that'll be a real problem. So we will spend 5 million now, and then if we get into the Champions League, we can then spend the extra 5. And I think we've seen that again this season. We talked to that the other night, one of the pods. Sima, I think, is an example of a player that I'm fairly confident we'd have gone back to had we gone into the Champions League, and maybe even if we got past that one round, I don't know. But certainly had we got to the Champions League, I'm pretty confident Sima, maybe not, he maybe would be here, not guaranteeing that, but we'd have gone back to try and bring him back. But without that funding, we simply couldn't.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And it's interesting, you made me think of 2012 there, Malmo's beat us, and that's what Craig White hung his horse on, didn't it? Who knows what the world would have turned out if we made the Champions League then. So I'm going to get Doug now to stick on the slides for this. So this is who has been bought, I think, over this last, in the year that Clement's been here. So there is 4, 8, 10. My eyesight's not so great there. So he spent £12 million net, roughly just under £12 million net in that year. I'm going to come. I mean, you're looking at that same as I am. I'm just going to come back to you for your kind of comments on how that reflects with the question back the manager side, the board has it been supported? So I'm going to come at you, Ricky, first.
Well, I think
this isn't arguing about the quality of the player; it's more about whether it's been supported.
Well, I'm actually quite pleased with the recruitment under Clement. I think there's a lot of players, especially in that slide there, who are certainly on the plus side for me. Everybody on the left-hand side of the slide, going down Jeffy. Ciala, we've still got to see, he's only a young boy, didn't have a great pre-season, looked a bit of a sort of scatterbrain, but he you don't play for AC Milan if you're a dud. Conor Barron, brilliant. Cortez, he's now our player, although I believe we've got to pay the $4 million for him at the end of the season. So yeah, he's a good player. I can't pronounce that by his name, but I've not seen him yet. So yeah, those signings for me are all going to be good players for Rangers going forward. And if we can, so I go back to my previous conversation before Tom and Doug had their say we come not being backed. For us to progress financially, there's always going to be a little bit of a gamble here. There's got to be, and this is with the board. If we don't score goals, and we're going to go with Dessers, and it's not a Dessers bashing, guys, he's the man that sits up top. If we don't score goals and win games convincingly, we're not going to win the league. To win the league, that gets you the opportunity to the Champions League. It's then the jackpot money. We are screaming for a number one striker. Dessers ain't that player. Now, we had a chance to go and get Romani when he was at Steaua Bucharest. We could have went and got that player, and the board never backed him, in my opinion. And that to me then, it just shows me how the money the backing that Clement thought he was going to get from this current board wasn't there. You've got to bear in mind as well the players that we've released. I think it's upwards of £200,000 a week in wages we've released. Now, surely that money could have went in free transfer, to bring in some more free. We brought in certainly on a free. I get that's where we're paying a certain amount of his wages, if not at all.
Can I ask a question, Ricky? So if you're losing $10 million a year and you need to reduce the wage bill, is that not the reason why you can't continue to pay more?
This is the other side of the argument, Gary. I get that, but if you're if you want to capitalise and win the league to earn your money, you've got to have a side on the pitch that's going to do that. We were desperate for a striker. Romani was available. He was going to be available for about £4.5 million, I believe he was, and we never pursued it.
But can I just come in there, Ricky? and just I'll keep it short. But were we in desperate need of a striker? Our striker scored 26 goals last season. How many more realistically is another striker going to score in the league? And the other side of it as well is the goals weren't coming from other areas of the team. That's for me where our problem lies. But as I say, that could be for another day, because I know we need to shift on this, so I won't take up any more time.
I totally agree with you, Tomo. We need to start scoring from all over the pitch. I get that, mate. There was a time we were scoring all over the pitch, and I mentioned in the pod the other night there, when we've got our best four front on the pitch going forward, with Agami through the middle, your two decent wingers with the Bajrami through the number 10 role, we will start scoring goals. I've got no doubt about that. But it's just taken a little bit too long for us to get there. And I just don't think Clement was backed enough to get to this stage. We're at a good stage now, mate, I believe. The Celtic drubbing, it is what it is. But we could have been far better prepared prior to the season starting had Clement been backed, in my opinion.
No, I wouldn't. There's lots of ways you could delve into that further. There's maybe another pod around tactics and how so. Tom, just for you then, looking at where we're at now, very briefly, so we can move on to the next one shortly. Has he been backed?
I believe he has been backed, yes. So fact, he has been backed, yeah.
Fact, he has been backed. Doug, yourself?
Yeah, I think he has been. I mean, see there, he spent just over £14 million. I think that's a reasonable amount of money, and it's not too dissimilar to what other managers have spent. Slightly more than some, slightly less than others. So yeah, I think we've backed him reasonably well. Like you say, could have pushed the boat a little bit and had a couple of things gone our way, like for example, maybe getting shot a Dowell, or if Davies had been a sale rather than a loan, maybe that changes something. If Matondo had gone, there's a couple of things that I think would have led to us making maybe some more moves. At the end of the day, there's only so much control the club has over that. Obviously, Hadji is a big one in terms of if we manage to sell him. But I think we've backed him, and more importantly, I think we'll continue to as well. So I think they're looking to do things responsibly, like Tomo said, in terms of managing the budget and reducing costs, reducing wages. Now that they've got some of those things in place in terms of the start, they can then use that to, if they manage to maintain a bit of reasonable levels in those things, then they can continue to back him at a reasonable level in the windows to come.
Yeah. So concluding that one, we've got Tomo thinks that it's fiction, and he has been backed, as does Doug. I think, Ricky, if I'm rightly, and tell me if I'm wrong, you're saying that it's probably fiction, but he could have pushed the boat a bit further and gave a little bit more to him. Is that?
Yeah, like I can see where the guys are coming from there, and I know, and I can lean to what their sentiments are. I just felt it was all a little bit too late in coming with those champions. We needed to get to the Champions League to get money. We've got these players in, and I just think they should have come in well before they did to give us that fighting chance to qualify for the Champions League, because it's proper money, and that's what we're lacking.
So we're going to conclude that one and put it in the statement that the board hasn't backed him is now becoming fiction in our view, never to disagreed with again. Our last one, we've got 10 minutes or so left in the pod, so the last one we're going to talk about is, and it's looking probably a bit broader, there's a lot of talk about how we've regressed as a club since 2022, since the Halicon days of the Europa League final, when we had Joe Aribo up front, Cedric Itten on the bench. There's actually, funny enough, that whole lie, we never had a striker, we didn't want to play him at that final. I remember Cedric Itten was never actually getting a game, but people forget that fact in some ways. But anyway, we're looking at squad in 2022 versus the squad in 2024. And one of the things it says is the squad's regressed significantly in the last 2 years. It's a fact. Is that a fact? Tom, I'll come to you first.
I would say yes. I mean, you've got to... I would say you look at the squad that we have today, 18th of September 2024, would that squad get to the final back in 2022 and beat the teams that team beat and I would have to say no, they wouldn't have done. So I would say that is a fact. We have regressed, and we sold the likes of Bassey for big money and didn't replace him. And that's where our issues have come from the last couple of years in terms of our spending. So, yeah, I would say that's a fact, Gary.
That's right. Fact. So you've got fact, Doug. Fact or fiction? And you've got the benefit of having seen the squad that none of us have.
Yeah. I mean, I think even without having seen it, I think the obvious answer is a fact that they were not the team that we were that year. I mean, in some ways, I wouldn't expect us to be. That's a team that got to a Europa League final. Not every Rangers team does that. So, I wouldn't. In all honesty, I wouldn't expect us to be that at that level. So I think the questions are more, how far away from that are we, and why aren't we? And if we are far away, why are we so far away from it? And I think there's a couple of interesting points to get to when we get into the discussion on that.
Yeah, do you know, actually, it made me think that maybe I should have said the squad of 2020 versus the squad of 2024, and that might be an interesting one to actually see where we were at as we were on the journey at that point in time, and which is what we're on again just now. Ricky, yourself, fact or fiction?
Well, I think it's definitely fiction, because this current team, so far this season, ain't going to get to a Europa Cup final. It'd be very difficult for me to do that. But when you go back to the team that was in the cup final, Seville, so it's been alluded to, Bassey, Aribo, they were sold for upwards of £25 million. We got all the money that came in from the revenue of getting to that final. So goes back to the fact, was the manager backed with all that money that was there? I'm not sure, because we've regressed. But I will clearly say this right now. I think right now, with what Clement's brought in and what we've got, if we can keep everybody fit, we have got a very good team in the making. But we just need to keep everybody fit. I think we're quite strong across the board. And I think there's a lot of craft in there. There's a lot of energy. And the new signings that Clement's got in, we were just starting to introduce into the team now. I think we've got a lot of ability, and I'm quite looking forward to the season. So we're not anywhere near the kind of team that was in the final in Seville, but we're not a million miles away.
And on that note, I think we'll get Doug to light it up and put the teams up. So we've got the 2022 squad versus the 2024 one. There's some interesting ones there. I'm not going to comment on it. I'm going to ask you to have anything that jumps out to you when you look at it, and anything you pick up on. I'm going to come to Tom. In fact, I'll come to Doug first to give others a chance to look at it. Doug's seen it in a bit more detail. So just your observations, having looked at the different squads over the period, was there anything jumped out?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that immediately jumped out that I didn't realise at the time is that squad had 52 players over the course of the season. And that does include some players who left like partway through the year and things like that. But 52 players, that is a ridiculous amount. And I mean, you can see in the slide that I've kind of tried to put players to be kind of like for like to a degree, and that might unfairly weigh some of the comparison. But you can see, I mean, already there's not all 52 players on there. There's a lot of younger players and things that didn't necessarily play at all. But even with them not all being there, the squad is much smaller. But that's actually a good thing. This is one of the things that I sort of was touching on before when I said I think there are still pluses to be taken. The amount of wages we must have been paying for a squad that size, given a lot of the players, you've got players like Jack Simpson, who was that classic championship kind of buy. He was probably on he wouldn't have been a huge wage here, but he would have been on a reasonable amount. So, we've brought wages down. The squad is much smaller now. We're sitting around about 34. So it's interesting, like you say, I think we've weighed it slightly in terms of the timings of the squad we've picked. Like you say, if you pick the squad a year earlier, or indeed if you just look at last year's squad, they're going to be a bit closer. But this was the peak we talked about the changing the era, that Clement's here to see the end of an era and start a new one. This squad, and I should point out, if it's not obvious, the orange is the 2022 squad. That was the peak of that era. You know, getting to that Europa League final. That was these players at their absolute peaks. The majority of them, in terms of they were performing at their best. And I saw someone in the comment talking about the team having heart. You know, they were, a lot of them were players who played together for a couple of years by this point, so they had that sort of togetherness and that heart and that desire, all those things that you want, as well as the technical side. Whereas our current team are at the start of that journey. This is the bottom of their hopeful bell curve, that they will potentially, hopefully, rise together, grow, find themselves that heart and that togetherness, and hopefully the ability to win things and do well. But there's definitely a few interesting comparisons. I'll let the guys dig into them. Haven't had a look at it. There's also obviously there's a reasonable amount of players that are still there as well. So obviously the obvious is the James Tavernier, who is not the player that he was back then, and you know, performs a different function slightly now than he did in that previous team. So yeah, I think it's an interesting one. But the standout for me that I didn't realise was how big that squad was, and I'm happy that we don't have a squad that size today.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting actually. You know, that's the first time looking at it as well in any depth. But the number of players that actually people don't particularly rate, looking back on it now as well, you know, it's quite interesting. There's a number of them that aren't well remembered. There's some that are obviously heroes, but there's some that are long lost in the memory, thankfully, in some cases. Tomo, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you look at that squad from 2022, and you know, the way it ended for some players, like Lundstrom, Ryan Jack, Borna Barisic, Connor Goldson. These are just some of the players that I'm just pulling out. Even Kamar Ruth, you know, they were important players to us. They were excellent players who were performing on a weekly basis. I said we were a much better team when Ryan Jack was fit and was in that team. And the way it ended with them, unfortunately, clouds our sort of memories of maybe the better times. And I won't go into it too much, but it's what's happening, I think, with Tavernier. He's had some great moments, but because he's not at the level he once was, we're forgetting the good things that he has brought us, and we're just focusing on the negative. So there were a lot of good players there who left for decent money. Look at Glenn Kamara. We haven't replaced him. We haven't replaced Stephen Davis. I mean, the next question is how do you replace players like them? You know, Aribo looked like he was just down the park playing with his mates most of the time. When he went out on the football pitch, just looked really natural. And then Stephen Davis was just he was just a level above everyone. So I think that squad was a very good squad. Should have probably won more. Probably should have won the final. We have a fit Morales. We probably do win that final. But I think we're on the right tracks. And as Doug says, having that smaller squad is certainly encouraging.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Tomo. I'm going to come. Ricky, your thoughts on looking at the two quite interesting squads?
Yeah, and see, if you look at the players like for like, Tomo alluded to the older players, the steady kind of experience, who have basically gone now. Your Lundströms and your Connor Goldsons, and that we probably had them at their peak, and that team drastically needed to change because they were all at the back end of their career. Hence why the transition is at the moment. Maybe it's just lack of forethought or whatever. But we are where we are. But looking at the like for likes, Scotty Arfield was a fantastic player for us. Box to box, scored goals, and he's, you know, if Tom Lawrence is his kind of replacement, he's nowhere near the kind of standard of what Scotty Arfield was for me. Another one was Fashion Sakala. Fashion was a great player. You know, sometimes he could blow up, but he was just a workaholic. Scored important goals, gave you options, fast as anything, and there's no way Matondo's anywhere near the kind of standard that Sakala offered us. And that was another player that I think it was Beale was quite happy to get rid of because he wasn't looked upon as being good enough for us. But going back to that squad, I don't see how we are that far behind that squad that got to that 11. I do agree with Tomo that Stephen Davis is impossible to replace. He was just a fantastic player, but I've got great hopes for young Bailey Rice. I think he's a star of a player. I know he's only a young boy, 17 or something, but I just desperately hope that the club get him involved this year and get him some game time, get him some experience, because he's a major asset to us.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it has been interesting looking at it. You obviously invested heavily in the strikers that year, which helped us go far with Roof and Itten on the presumption Morelos was leaving, if I remember rightly. But you've got a number of guys like Aribo, Kamara, Bassey, Jack, Davis. I think somebody's mentioned Stephen Davis in the comments. These guys cost, what, 50 grand between them all? And some of it was about the right timing for them, the right timing for us. And some of it also, as Doug said, is about them developing over a couple of years to build into a squad, which is what hopefully they're going to do now. But, I mean, Matt, looking at that briefly for me, player for player, I think there's an argument that's not significantly different. There's ones that improved dramatically with Peter, but there's potential. And guys like Barron and Rice and other ones you've talked about that could get to that similar level. So we'll come round to the houses very quickly just to finish off and say, fact or fiction in terms of the squad is inherently weaker than the one in 2022. Tomo, fact or fiction?
I would say it's a fact, Gary. I think we are weaker than the one in 2022, but I'll caveat that with it's got potential.
No, thank you. And just as I see a thing here, if you've not subscribed yet while you're watching, please subscribe. You're coming to the end, so you're going to miss your chance for today. So please get it done as soon as you possibly can. Just a couple of buttons. Ricky, fact or fiction, the squad's weaker than it was in 2022?
Well, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Tomo. I think we'll agree that it's fact that it's weaker, but I am very, very optimistic, given time this season, that squad that we've got now currently, and added to that come January, if he gets one or two players in, and let's hope he does, then we will be able to finish the season very, very strongly. But at this moment in time, we are weaker than what we were. So, yeah, it's a fact. And thanks very much for having us tonight, Gary. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Good debate as always.
Thank you, Ricky. That was interesting. It's nice to chat through some of these different things. And Doug, as I say, thank you again for doing all the work on it and allowing us to turn up and ask the questions. Your final thoughts?
My pleasure. Always happy putting these things together. Yeah, I mean, 3 for 3. That it's a fact that we're not the team that we were then. Like Tomo said, there are caveats. We're at a different point in the journey than that team was, and hopefully this team will be able to get to that point as well. A couple more bodies added in the windows to come, and maybe a few other changes, players developing, etc. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that point actually about the strikers and us having. I do remember that. I was thinking Morelos was gone, or was going to go, so signing Roof and Itten, and then thinking we had too many strikers because Morelos didn't go. And it kind of makes me think, imagine we'd sold Dessers quick out the door because we wanted to get the rebuild, and then we were where we are now. We could be in a lot of trouble without him, given what's been going on with injuries and Igamani figuring out that he existed so he could come onto the pitch. So yeah, it's interesting to see how those kind of things pan out, and it'll be interesting to see how this team pans out. But I agree with the guys. Definite fact with caveats, and I look forward to them hopefully developing into something, if not equally exciting, then similarly so.
Yeah, no, thank you. So we're now an hour, so I think it's probably time to wrap up. You'll see from picking 3 simple statements and discussing them, time can go by very quickly. And I think if you've been listening to this, you've hopefully enjoyed it. You've probably thought of lots of statements and lots of discussion points your own. You maybe want to challenge. There are many about Rangers, and that's what makes it quite interesting. We're all fans. We've all got opinions. We've all got different opinions, and sometimes it's nice to just have a chat around those opinions and challenge them a little bit. See whether we agree with them. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes we'll keep our beliefs no matter what, irrespective of whether the truth says otherwise. I think that's us for tonight. Tomorrow night we have a Q&A as usual at 9 o'clock. as we've said many times, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and we will see you tomorrow night. Well, some of us will see you tomorrow night. And thank you just now. Every night is a Rangers Journal night. Good night.